Microphone. If we add this, then it means I can look at it if I want to come up with an insult for Adam Kokesh. You are cruelly depriving a village of an idiot. I'm really irked about the fact that for some reason my laptop can be... Jesus Christ, that's gonna fall over. Let's get rid of the empty cream egg box. So I genuinely don't know why it is that despite having my microphone I was going to say it is like a foot and a half, let's say, away from where my laptop is, and having my mouth like 4 inches away from where my microphone is, the microphone still seems to pick up the sound of my laptop's fan louder than my voice. Now, you might say that if I just had a decent camera, I probably wouldn't have a fan, but I don't have a decent camera, do I? So we're basically back to square one. What I will try and do is... How's that? How's that? Okay guys, enough fucking around of audio. Time to do what I came here to do, which is respond to Adam Kokesh's book. But I can't find Adam Kokesh's book, because I didn't buy it. I can't find my phone. What's that? Adam versus the man. Education. Gonna teach us everything that we need to know. War. Hello guys, so today I will be doing some more reading about Kokesh. And when I say today, I should clarify that, like I said, I am basically recording a lot of these videos in bulk. However, to give away, to provide a unique experience every single video, I'm going to change my t-shirt during the day, even though I am filming them a lot of them in the same day, which basically means that I'm changing my t-shirt for no reason other than that I don't want to give away exactly the span over which I film these, because I know that you will think I'm a bit of a loser if I recorded 10 videos all in one night. Of course I wouldn't do that, that would just be weird. Anyway, so today I will be responding to Adam Kokesh's book, Freedom, and I will be reading a chapter called War. This chapter has 7 parts. Now, the last chapter I did had 4 parts, and it took me quite a while to respond to it. However, this chapter is slightly better because he says some more intelligent things. So he says things that are kind of obvious. War is bad, killing people is bad. I mean, at worst, most of the things he says are a bit simplistic. So, speaking of simplistic, let's read the first quote. First chapter is The Greatest Crime Against Freedom. And our first quote is, if the worst crime that can be committed against an individual is murder, then the worst possible crime is organised, deliberate, self-righteous, mass murder. I guess I should just briefly point out that there is a difference between murder and killing someone. The same way there's a difference between taking property and theft. It's about the justifications for doing so and the context in which you do it. If you take back your property from someone who's stolen it, it's not theft. And likewise, if you shoot someone in self-defense, it's not murder. I mean, unless it was really easily preventable. Also, another pedantic point, all murders are deliberate, or else they're called manslaughter. And also, as I say, not all deliberate killings have to be murder, such as self-defense. And secondly, I'm not sure how a murder being organised makes it any worse, and I'm also not really sure how a murder being self-righteous makes it any worse. I think you could make an argument that self-righteous murder is worse, but I think it's also kind of dependable. I'll give an analogy. For example, I'm against the death penalty because I think that killing someone who is presenting no immediate threats to society because of a self-righteous conviction that we ought to kill murderers is wrong in my opinion. However, killing someone because they are fighting for a dictator who wants to murder his own citizens, I think, is an example of a good instance of self-righteous killing. What makes something immoral is not whether or not it's self-righteous, but rather whether the context in which it's done is an immediate threat or not. War is just a word that governments use to make mass murder and theft seem acceptable. No, actually, that isn't the etymological or linguistic origins of the word war, funnily enough. It wasn't a creation of the recurring characters in the fantasy series created by Adam Kokesh. The government, who are made up of anarchists, the government who is made up entirely of people who actually think the government is unnecessary, and therefore use semantic tricks to convince the public that they have a purpose. These aren't very fleshed out characters. Personally, they're not really very relatable, and I struggle to become emotionally involved in the series just because a lot of the actions of the characters seem to be irrational. It's a bit ridiculous that you could have governments existing for thousands of years and they've been consistently made up of people, apparently, who all acknowledge that the government has no reason to exist, and all have used very similar semantic tricks to convince the public. It's hard to imagine. I guess that's why it's a fantasy series. I can only imagine that the first time people began to distinguish military actions from domestic crime was around the time when people first stopped being idiots and started to appreciate that there is an actual qualitative difference between these two actions. Only the sickest and most deranged individuals support murder as a matter of policy, and only the sickest and most deranged governments engage in war. Personally, if I had intelligence about the Holocaust in 1943, assuming in a hypothetical scenario where Britain wasn't at war with Germany, I can say that I would support war as a matter of policy to end the murder of what would maybe be as much as 6 million Jews, depending on just how much foreign land Germany would have conquered in this hypothetical scenario. I also don't see how these humanitarian concerns are in any way distinct from the fact that if Adam Kokesh's anarcho-capitalist utopia was invaded, he would support civilians fighting to the death and murdering, or killing, as many people would describe it, in order to defend this land. This would be pretty standard issue self-defense. The only difference is I'm not talking about self-defense, I'm talking about defending those who cannot defend themselves when I talk about humanitarian intervention and when other people talk about humanitarian intervention. And apparently, if you support defending people who can't defend themselves, defending them from oppressive regimes, then you are a deranged lunatic and you are sick. To get away with it, they have to convince a critical mass of the population to materially support it. It's not too difficult when they're already convinced that murder is acceptable if enough people do it. So apparently we're convinced that murder is acceptable if enough people do it, which to me seems a bit weird because lots of people were engaged in the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide, and we still generally thought it was an immoral thing that required immediate humanitarian intervention in the form of war. There were more people involved in the Rwandan genocide and the Holocaust than there were involved in the Falklands War. I think it's reasonable to say that people's varying attitudes towards the death of innocent civilians has less to do with the number of people doing it and more to do with the actual qualitative, functional difference between a war and first-degree murder or genocide and war crimes. It is massive organised violence for the purpose of expanding government power. Obviously, unless you are anarchist factions in Catalonia who fought against government itself. Heck, we really shouldn't forget Adam Kokesh's brave libertarian warriors who would passionately defend themselves against any sort of totalitarian force. Also, how did the humanitarian intervention in East Timor to prevent its annexation by the Indonesian government in any way expand state power? Most of the people involved in that war were fighting for governments who really had nothing to do or nothing to gain from this action, other than the general good spirit of defending a small country from annexation from a large superpower. What government's power was expanded greatly by the humanitarian intervention during the genocide in the Balkans? even if there were small advantages for some of the states involved, it seems pretty dismissive to claim that this was the only reason why these interventions occurred. I admit that the vast majority of wars do relate in some way to the expansion of state power, and I am critical of humanitarian intervention in the majority of forms in which it has occurred. However, there are enough counterexamples to illustrate that wars can't be defined in terms of how they expand state power. There are lots of things that aren't wars that do a lot more to expand state power, and a lot of the time, wars have much greater effects than just in terms of how they expand an individual state's power. Wars make governments more powerful, and more powerful governments are better at ripping people off. What, you mean like China in World War II and Russia in World War I? Those great powerful governments which ultimately fell to popular revolution, in one case even before the war had ended, they experienced a massive expansion of state power when their states were overturned. When has a war ever weakened a government? After all, wars aren't fought against governments, they're fought against people. There's never been a government that has collapsed because of war. Especially not the victor. We've never, ever, in the history of the human race, seen the victor of a war turn out ultimately worse off because of having fought the war. Adam Kokesh says so. And I don't think we've ever seen him be wrong about a sweeping assessment of history before. Governments use war as an excuse to increase taxation. When they can frighten people with a foreign threat, this is much easier. Once convinced, not only will they pay their taxes enthusiastically, they will attack anyone who suggests taxes should be lower. What exactly do governments gain from increasing taxation? The money goes to the war. It doesn't go to the government. I agree that one of the benefits to war involves a lot of corporatist backdoor dealings with the military-industrial complex. However, what he's saying here seems to be implying that it is war itself that gets the government's rocks off. The government just wants to create war so they can tax people for some reason. This is a very peculiar government that Adam Kokesh is creating. You may have heard of the different models of government that people have made when they've been engaged in the statecraft of their fantasy kingdoms. A lot of people will maybe go for a feudal system or a theocratic system or monarchy, maybe even a socialist system, a republic. Adam Kokesh has gone for a very unique world in which the official form of government is this'll get them. It was actually the political philosophy, the Plato in Adam Kokesh's fantasy kingdom. Instead of the Republic, it was actually called the Rus, and it was basically just a big joke where they were like, oh, let's convince people to accept a government that we admit is unnecessary, and then tax them for the fun of it. Somehow the entirety of civilization was built up upon this idea. It was the joke was taken too far, and unfortunately I'm not recording this on April Fool's Day, so I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. Also, you may know that Tolkien, when he created this fantasy world, was very interested in linguistics. Adam Kokesh, when he created this fantasy world he's describing in this book, was also similarly interested in linguistics. However, his main concern with linguistics was, of course, the study of how every single word that's ever been used is actually part of a secret plot to convince people that murder and theft are okay. And he's basically against language, ultimately, because all words are just part of some evil propaganda. So watch out for words. You should probably ignore this video because most of the words that I'm using in this video are actually they were crafted by the government. I was strapped into the chair that you're strapped into in school and denied the right to see the anarcho-capitalist literature that might have convinced me that all of anarcho-capitalism is true. And they just slapped me in the face of a dictionary until I decided that murder is okay when governments do it. I assume your experiences were basically the same. War diverts an incredible amount of productive capacity from serving demand in the market to destruction. Yes, war is bad. Do you know what else is bad, though? Being a victim of genocide or foreign occupation. Do you know what we call it when we respond to the initiation of force with efforts to quell the violence? We call it an essential principle of libertarian justice. Also a war, if enough people are involved. Remember, war is bad, and we don't really need a practical way of stopping war. All we need is just to say that war is bad. You might think that this requires some type of political science that actually addresses instances where war might be just or war can be used to create further stability. No, I don't think you're understanding the point clearly. War is bad. A lot of you might say, well, shouldn't we have a theory to create peace, like the democratic peace theorists, or the commercial liberalism, where peace is maintained through close interdependence? And similarly, what about functionalism, functional regionalism? You might propose all of these theories. These theories are good, but ultimately what you have to understand is war is bad. Okay? You can talk about your practical solutions and your honest assessments and your efforts to find some type of nuanced middle ground between absolute pacifism, even in the event that it's entirely unpractical, and shooting people in the head for fun. Ultimately, I don't know if Adam Kokesh has made this clear, war is bad, okay? And I think I should probably just repeat that over and over for the rest of the video. War is bad. It's very bad. The next chapter is soldiering, and it begins: once a government has developed a strong sense of national identity and patriotism among its citizens, it is not particularly difficult to convince a large number of them to sign up to defend the collective. Okay, so if fascists invaded my town of Milton Keynes, for whatever reason, then I would fight against it. If I could get hold of a gun, I would use a gun. If I had an opportunity to kill them, I would kill them. And this isn't because of nationalism or patriotism or statism. It's because I want to defend my fellow human beings, people I care about, from living under fascist tyranny. And it seems to me that Adam Kokesh is basically arguing that it's better to let your fellow human beings live under tyranny than it is to use any sort of military strategies or murder to protect them. Presumably because caring about other people is collectivism, and if you care about whether or not your Jewish neighbour is killed, then you must just be an authoritarian who has been convinced by state Zionist propaganda that murder is ever justified. It's not ever, never, even in the face of fascism. But again, no connection at all between libertarianism and fascism, none, basically. Maybe that they have incredibly similar goals, and it may be that both of them frequently argue that the other's position is basically valid, but no, they're completely different, I promise. The human tendency to cooperate is much stronger than the tendency to fight, so it takes a significant amount of conditioning to make war possible. Humans may want to cooperate, but the reality is there are 7 billion human beings on the planet, and yes, sometimes they're going to disagree on ideological issues. Other times they're just going to disagree because they're emotional and angry and violent simply because of shitty situations they've been pushed into. If one half of China thinks that control over productive capacity should be based on possession, and the other half of China thinks that it should be based on contracts and hierarchy that benefit a rich elite, then China is going to have a civil war. If one half of America thinks that the right to control your own labour is inalienable, and therefore slavery is immoral, and another half of America thinks that ownership should be based on contracts and hierarchy that benefit a rich elite, then America is going to have a civil war. and America did have a civil war. The cooperation of humanity, which by the way is not actually being shown to exist in this book really, it's just presumed, but to the extent that human beings are naturally cooperative, there is equally an extent to which they absolutely disagree and hate each other. To be a soldier is to take a stand against your own freedom. Yeah, those fucking French soldiers who fought against the Nazis just hated their own freedom. What were they doing? If you love your own freedom, my advice would be run out with your hands up. Just, sorry, could have fought against you, but I didn't hate my own freedom enough, so put your boot on my head and send me to the camps, please. When we see through the propaganda of collectivism, there will be no more militaries. When we hold each other accountable for individual acts of violence, there will be no more war. When we demand our freedom, there will be no more soldiers. So what he's basically saying here is that when there's no reason for war, there will be no war. A 5-year-old could have told you that. I guess the main difference is that a 5-year-old probably wouldn't have spent 2 chapters telling you that. Again, Adam Kokesh does live in a world where he is surrounded by straw men who probably call him names and aren't very nice. By the way, I found out my books in the background, usually I do. Adam Kokesh lives in a world where he is surrounded by straw men who presumably crowd around him and call him names. But they don't really. And in Adam Kokesh's world, there are 2 types of people. People who blindly say war is bad, regardless of any practical reason or reality that might suggest that war is necessary, and people who love war, and even if we lived in a world of perfect pro-scarcity where everyone was a communist, they would still just fight each other for the fun of it. Neither of these assessments are positions that anyone should hold to. Apparently, Adam Kokesh holds to the former. The most rational people say, yeah, war is bad, but at the end of the day, war's happening, and the best we can do is try and make sure that the end result of that war leads to a more peaceful and stable society. It's not enough. Saying war is bad doesn't stop bullets, and it doesn't bring dead civilians back to life. Only actual practical intervention is going to protect people. Do you ever, you've got like a song in your head and you're talking, and while you're talking you have the song in your head? I've got that over the Pixies, Is She Weird? It's really getting my nerves. I'm talking and I'm reading, and all I've got in the back of my head is just Chapter? The motivation for war. This is, I'm willing to bet that we're going to take another dive into the fantasy world Adam Kokesh has created, and I assume it is involved. This will be a laugh, and I like killing people because it's fun. So let's see. Today most of them claim they only use military force for defensive purposes. But if all governments only fought defensive wars, militaries wouldn't be necessary. Yes, good point. But this would only make sense if all governments claim to fight defensive wars. However, it's not all governments that claim to fight defensive wars. Some governments are pretty right on about the fact that they just support fighting wars in order to make advances for themselves for entirely offensive reasons. Also, how many governments even claim to have armies that exist solely for defensive purposes? I imagine it's only really armies in Latin America and maybe some parts of Africa and East Asia. Most Western governments are pretty forward about the fact that their governments exist at least for humanitarian intervention, and most of the time to defend their interests. And it's worth noting the trouble with the idea that governments exist for defence, and this is both trouble with the use of that term, but also the trouble with saying Well, the government's fought to defence, and how to explain this contradiction is that the term defence is really broad. And, for example, a lot of countries will say that they're defending themselves by making a preemptive strike. This concept of a preemptive strike. That's why, like, for example, the thought that immediately clicked into my head as an example of a government that fought for 100% offensive reasons was Iraq in the Iraq-Iran war, because they just invaded. But even then, even in that case, Iraq was saying, well, we're worried that Iran is so powerful, we have to invade them in order to make sure that we've got a buffer them, things like that. You know, it's because the world is so global, and also the fact that the states aren't the be-all and end-all of international politics. There are organisations within states that have conflicting interests. That means that inevitably, simply saying that all states fight defensively doesn't necessarily mean you're never going to get wars. If, for example, let's say you have, I'll use an example of something that I brought up recently in JJ's Talks channel, talk about the war in Yemen. Let's say on the one hand you have a socialist party who, this is the war in Yemen is, as someone pointed out on the channel, between the Shiites and the Sunnis, but there is a South Yemeni movement which is socialist. So let's say that Iran started supporting the Shiites in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia, as they are currently doing, started supporting the Sunnis in Yemen. Now, are either of these parties acting more or less defensively? It's difficult to say, because they're both trying to defend their own interests in this foreign place. So you can either argue that they're both acting equally offensively or equally defensively. But either way, you know, these are examples of situations where Adam Kokesh's assessment of international relations isn't appreciating all the full extent of the reality to international relations. I wonder how many books Adam Kokesh has read on international relations. Because I was looking for the international theory he accepts. I was reading this book on war. Clearly, he's not a realist. I think the position he accepts is regarding international theory. What's that? It's generally, when it comes to theoretical politics, the major theory advocated by anarcho-capitalism is what's that? Theory of property? What's that? Am I allowed to say that? I love this man. Governments like war because patriotism leads people to sacrifice for the imagined collective and tolerate more oppression. But governments, which are apparently superorganisms at this point and not dynamic organizations made up of a number of individuals, now just like people sacrificing themselves, they have no motivation other than their hatred for individual freedom. Governments are now the Aztecs. That's all they want. All they want is for a bunch of people to throw themselves into machine gun fire, and that just, it satisfies the government. I don't know if you've taken a political philosophy course, but one of the main things you learn is that unless we appease our government overlords with sacrifices, blood, the sun won't rise. We need to make sure the sun rises every day, so we sacrifice ourselves to the government. Anarcho-capitalists have seen through this, and that's why they aren't allowed to teach in schools. Anarcho-capitalists are very persecuted by academia. It's one of the many things they have in common with creationists. Patriotism reinforces the essential myth that governments act on behalf of the people, and the language of war often confuses the government itself with the people. Because hardened patriots have never, ever criticised the government. Oh, of course, except for maybe every notable patriot in recent history. I don't know if you remember that famous 1920s Hitler speech. I'm hilarious. The government acts on behalf of the people. In fact, why have we even created a party? We're patriots. Everyone knows it just means somebody who accepts everything about their country and endlessly supports it. Ooh! Is she wish? Moved on to another chapter already, the isolation of intervention. And it begins. When governments do not intervene, commerce between countries brings us together. When they make war, it drives us apart. What about if country has a huge amount of trade with another country, and then that country becomes socialist. What is the libertarian response to that? Is the libertarian response to accept this as a phenomenal loss for one that can't be avoided, or is the libertarian response to accept this as a just reason to go to war? I would be very interested to hear Adam Kokesh's response to this. He hasn't given anything that would indicate that he would actually oppose this, unless we are to accept that he actually just thinks war is bad all the time. But even then, it's difficult to say what he thinks of, say, socialists taking over the means of production. Because if he's always against war, if he's an absolute pacifist, then you would have thought the implication of that is socialism, because you can't defend the means of production. As far as I'm concerned, pacifism equals no property. As much as it's true that commerce does create a huge amount of stability between different countries, and that is something I talk about in my video on the EU and Brexit, it is also true that protectionism is necessary to maintain security in those negotiations, and that can lead to war quite easily. And for every time that commerce has created stability between countries, there is another instance where commerce has created a need for war. And if you want a really good example of that, just look at every single time a Latin American or South Asian or African country has moved towards nationalizing their oil or something else that the government needs, ends in war, for the precise reasons that Adam Kokesh suggests completely remove the possibility of war, commercial integration. To the extent that a war is supported by the people, it says, we would rather kill you than trade with you. It's a funny thing to say to genocidal maniacs. In Adam Kokesh's world, it would be, we're not saying we approve of your actions, North Korea, but how about a nice deal? Let's trade some of the timber that you produced with your slaves for some of our goods, and don't worry, there's no hard feelings to your people. We're very much against nationalism. However, if you want to have your people kept in slave conditions, then as long as they're not our people, white people, then that's fine. When an embargo is declared, it says anyone engaging in certain trade will be shot or bombed. As a result of that single threat, thousands of regular daily exchanges essential to the standard of living of millions may be cut off, and countless more potential exchanges might never happen. American ANCAPs, not North Korean dictators, but number one with North Korean dictators. If we just stop trying to police the world with our morals, then maybe businesses would be able to make a profit off of the slave labour in North Korea. So we're going to power through the next two chapters where he says foreign aid, and not much is said here. He basically just says some obvious points about how foreign aid can not be effective and is subject to corruption, but doesn't really address any of the counter-criticisms to that idea. And then the war on terror. Here he just says that the war on terror has been ineffective, and this much we can agree upon. That doesn't mean that the war on terror is bad in principle, though. Then we move on to real security. Given what we know about governments and the motivation for war, it seems absurd anyone would turn to one for security. Well, what do we know about the motivations for war? We do know quite a bit, obviously not from this book, from actual academic books we know quite a bit about the motivations for war. And from that it seems kind of obvious that we would at times support war, because almost all academic theory does say, let's be real here, sometimes shit's going to happen, and you can't handle the truth. This is basically what this guy needs shouting at him sometimes. If it tries to take over an area that costs more to control than it produces in taxes, it will soon abandon the effort. The best defense against invasion is to have no government. An invader would need to build tax collection mechanisms from scratch, and they would be extremely difficult and costly to maintain. This isn't actually true, again. If you want a good example of a government that would contradict this claim, socialist governments. A lot of socialist governments wouldn't collect tax, and at the same time it is still held to, by a lot of socialists, that the end goal of socialism, international socialism. I wouldn't, like I've said, I wouldn't support a system that collect tax. It wouldn't be a system that collected tax. However, it would be a system that aimed to make socialism completely universal globally, using war. I do support war, which is why I haven't been very nice to Kokesh yet. So yeah, I would, if the opportunity emerged, if there was, let's say, a socialist revolution, there would be British military troops in America fighting against the anarcho-capitalists, not because there was any interest in collecting tax, but simply because I support socialism. You know, anybody with integrity will generally support their ideas expanding into other areas, simply because they think they're moral. You don't really need a tax system in order to invade a country with concentrated military force, shoot a bunch of people, take lots of vital resources, and then leave. Unless this is going to be the absolute shithole that I assume it will be, people are going to have an incentive to invade, and it's not going to get difficult. And you know, there's always the fact that, particularly invading small portions, if you imagine this in the context of anarcho-capitalist America, a lot of the time it would probably be better for anarcho-capitalists if they just vacated the areas. So what I would expect, if America did become anarcho-capitalist, is contrary to what Adam Kokesh suggests, you would see Mexico, let's say, invading New Mexico, and basically just forcing out the people who live in New Mexico, and having Mexicans move in. Because there are enough people to fill up the planet at this point. You don't need to worry about convincing the people who might oppose it to join the government. You can just kick them out. It's not that difficult. Having no government informs potential invaders that if they try to take over the territory, they will lose. The message is, you might never be defeated in battle, but by the power of decentralized resistance, both violent and non-violent, you will lose because we are committed to freedom and will defeat any oppressor, foreign or domestic. This presumes that governments actually care about people living on the outskirts. There are a lot of people who live in villages and aren't directly oppressed by totalitarian governments. However, they still live incredibly substandard lives because of totalitarian governments. The institution of regular progressive taxes is a relatively recent invention. Prior to this, taxes were usually an ad hoc thing that would just involve a concentrated military moving into an area and seizing a large amount of money. As much as it's very admirable that ANCAPs insist that their countries wouldn't succumb to war, they do ultimately fall to my ultimate criticism of anarcho-capitalism, which is that they don't seem to have presented any reason to believe that at the vast majority of points in time there wouldn't be some area that was undergoing a stage of destructive warfare, meddlesome oppression, or tiresome reconstruction. Like I say, as a socialist, I would support invading an anarcho-capitalist territory the second there was any sign that workers were revolting, mostly just because I wouldn't want to see hundreds of thousands of workers be killed in a pointless civil war. So that's a good chunk of anarcho-capitalist America gone there, because the workers would know that all you have to do is spark a revolt, and immediately any socialist power that exists would jump on that. But even then, you know, if you want to talk about fascist powers that are based on capitalist institutions like collecting taxation and exploiting labour, then that's not hard to imagine either. You just need a military headquarters that will at times go out with concentrated military forces and just fuck with people, you know, pillage. Governments were funded that way for the majority of human history. It is not as terrible as, or as impossible as Adam Kokesh makes it sound. And certainly, as Adam Kokesh acknowledges, governments aren't always completely rational. So, at the end of the day, even if what he says is true, and an anarcho-capitalist society wouldn't succumb to a profitable invasion, shit, there are not very profitable invasions going on right now. And the reality is that they're still occurring, they're still having very real negative effects for the people doing that. What ultimately we're being told is we can have anarcho-capitalism, and again, it's the same idea that I've touched on, I don't think in a video as part of this series, but certainly a video I've made, and it's this idea of yeah, sure, anarcho-capitalism will be a tremendously unstable system where there'll be factions constantly fighting and things like that. But we can sustain it. We can maintain it. Even when foreign powers are invading, socialists are blowing shit up left, right, and centre just to create some form of insurrection. Even when all of this is the case, anarcho-capitalism can be maintained. And I'm left thinking, why would I want it to be maintained? I've got a reasonable life. Chances are, if you're watching this, if you own a device on which you can watch this, then you're living a life that is good enough that you have no reason, no tangible reason, to want to live in a system where you will be invaded. Sometimes I think I afford a maybe to anarcho-capitalist ideas. I say, well, maybe there is a conceivable, unlikely situation in which this will go well. Not here. There is no way that you would have anarcho-capitalism without both socialist revolutions, including terrorism, and foreign occupation. Absolutely no way. I have not seen. I would need a very compelling argument to suggest that establishing an anarcho-capitalist society isn't not necessarily signing your own death warrant, but signing your warrant to say, make my life worse, please. Governments of the world, socialist factions, make my life as a capitalist who was stupid enough to believe that capitalism could work without the government, make it terrible. That's what I'm seeing when I see people argue like this. So that was part 3 of Socialist response to adding Kokesh and Spirit Freedom. And hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you are looking forward to the next episode, which will be, I haven't actually made you look forward to anything yet. The next episode will be on personal security, crime, things like that. It's very interesting. Again, we get more of these rehashed Molyneux ideas. A lot of the stuff that was discussed here was actually rehashed in Molyneux's ideas, particularly that last thing I was focusing on. Hopefully you're looking forward to that more now. That's what it's about. And I guess at this point I would probably say share if, having watched 3 of these, you think they're really good, and if having watched 3 of these you think they're shit, or if having watched 3 of these you think they're not the best representation of what's on this channel, then obviously don't. But thank you for watching anyway, and I hope you enjoyed it. This